In this video, we're going to configure Windows Server 2022. So we've got a nice fresh install of the desktop experience, and now we want to go through those first few things that you need to do to configure a brand new server. I'm going to go ahead and log in with the administrator password that I set during install. And once Server Manager launches, whenever you reboot a server, you should look and see if there are any services that didn't start. Here, this is a delayed start, so it'll probably start on its own, but if you don't like red, like I don't like red, you can start it manually. And it will automatically refresh and everything goes green. We want to go over to the local server. One of the first things that I like to do is to set the time zone, because most of the servers I work with are going to join a domain, and the time on the new server has to be in sync with the time on the domain, otherwise it's not going to work. I'm going to go in here, change it to whatever time zone is appropriate. It doesn't have to be the same time zone as other servers, like let's say your domain controller is in Pacific time, but this new server is in Eastern time. That's fine. But the idea is that, let's say, according to this server, it's 5:38 p.m., and the other server, it's 2:38 p.m., that's a match. If one's at 5:38 p.m. Eastern and one's at 5:38 p.m. Pacific, that's a 3-hour clock skew, and the computer is not going to join the domain successfully. So make sure the clock is set up properly. The next thing I always take care of is the networking. So the servers, once they go through the install, they'll be set to use an IP address signed by DHCP. Typically with servers, we don't want the IP address to change. So we either leave them to DHCP, and then we go into DHCP and we make a reservation, or we give them a static IP address. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a static IP address. We're going to go into the properties of the network adapter, TCP/IP version 4. I'm going to give it 198.28.56.11, which is appropriate for this network. That is the correct subnet mask. I'll give it a default gateway. And if I plan to be joining a domain, I have to give it a DNS server that handles DNS for the domain, which I will do. If it doesn't show up, it's because you need to refresh. And we can see our IP address there. If I need to change the firewall, I can do that. Typically, we want remote management enabled. But the really important thing to do is to change the computer name. Unless this is a domain controller, we can always change the computer name after the fact. But to join the domain with this sort of auto-generated name and then change it, sometimes it makes Active Directory unhappy, so I always just reset the computer name before I do much of anything. We're going to go in and change the computer name. Common mistake students make is they'll click on that hyperlink, this box opens up, and they're like, ooh, I'm changing computer name, and they type in this box here. Notice this is the computer description. So then they wonder why they're still stuck with this name. You've got to actually hit change, and this is where you change the computer name. So this server is eventually going to become a domain controller, so I'm going to name it DC2. It says, well, you're going to have to reboot, okay? Like now. Perfect. After the reboot, we log back in. Server Manager launches, we go over to the local server tab, and we can see that the computer name has in fact changed. And now I want to join it to the domain. Even though this is going to become a domain controller, I am going to join the domain first and then promote it to a domain controller. The reason I like to get the server into the domain as soon as possible is because at that point it's going to pull down the group policy, which is going to configure the security settings. So I don't want to leave it hanging out without being hardened for any length of time. I'm going to go ahead and click on Workgroup. You're either a member of a workgroup or you're a member of a domain. So this is the hyperlink that we use to join the domain. Notice it's the same one that we use for the computer name. We hit change, and you can see either you're a member of a domain or you're a member of a workgroup. I'm going to click on domain, and in here we put the name of the domain we're going to join, which in this case is corp.corpnet.xyz. It's super important that before you go to this step, you have set a DNS server that hosts DNS for the domain. Otherwise, when we click OK here, we're going to get a DNS error. In our case, we're not going to get the error. Now, if that happens, and for some reason you can't fix DNS, which is not optimal at all, the best thing is to back out, fix DNS. Sometimes you can use just the NetBIOS equivalent of the domain name. Like I could just say corp, and that would work. But that is not preferable at all because it means that something is wrong with DNS and I can't fix it. But if your boss comes running in and says, no, you have to get this joined to the domain, you're not allowed to fix DNS, then that's a little bit of a workaround. In this case, we are going to use DNS. We're going to click OK, and because we provided the right information, we're prompted for a username and password that has the authority to join this server to the domain. In this case, I'm going to use the domain administrator, but in real life, you probably would have a username and password of your own. That's a domain admin. It says, welcome to the domain. Fantastic. You gotta have to reboot for this to take effect. Sure. How about right now? Perfect. That works for me. So once we reboot, we'll log back in. Server Manager launches. We go to the Local Server tab, and we can see that this computer is now a member of the domain corp.corpnet.xyz. So once we have our brand new server, we want to set the time zone, the networking, change the computer name, and join the domain. And those are the core things that we need to do to configure Windows Server right after the install.